Hello, everyone. This is Henri Fauteux of La Maison du 21e siècle, 21st Century Housing Magazine out of Quebec. And today, on April 3rd, 2023, I'm so happy to have epidemiologist David Carpenter with us today. How are you, David?
Oh, I'm doing very well, Andre. Thank you very much for having me.
It's been too long. Listen, I have to share my screen. I started a little PowerPoint just to do an intro so people understand. I learned about you reading Microwave News in 1989. I didn't find the original article, but as you know, you received, I believe, $5 million from New York State to head the New York Power Lines project for 5 years. Was that it?
Well, that's correct. I didn't really lead it so much as I was the executive secretary.
You managed?
So I collected a group of 9 people with expertise in various areas who really were responsible for the decisions made in our study. Then after the study was completed in 1987, I became the spokesperson for New York State on issues related to magnetic fields and EMF.
Because that study began, what, in the late 70s after the Wertheimer-Lepper paper in 79?
Well, the study began actually in about 1982. I came to Albany as the director of the New York State Health Department laboratories in 1980. And 2 weeks before I arrived in Albany, or about that, there had been a settlement between the State Public Service Commission and the state-owned utility that there should be an investigation into the possibility that magnetic fields were associated with an elevation in childhood leukemia.
Mm-hmm.
And this study that's on the screen by Nancy Wertheimer was one of the few bits of evidence that that might be the case. And there are many of us, including myself, who doubted that this could possibly be true.
Mm-hmm.
But nevertheless, it was an observation that had potentially very serious implications, and therefore concern about this study did very greatly influence the kinds of research projects that we used that $5 million to study.
The context was interesting because Quebec wanted to build the Great Whale hydroelectric project to export to New York State. That's, I think, one of the reasons for this study. And Great Whale was canceled after you published your paper, but I think it was maybe also a financial issue. And now we're talking about increasing hydro's power capacity by 50% by 2050. So they're going to try.
And a lot of that's going to be imported into New York.
Well, now New York just signed a contract with Hydro, as did Maine, and there's a lot of opposition. But we had a lot of excess power. Now they said that we're going to have to do a lot of energy efficiency and build thousands of wind turbines by 2050 if we want to keep going and decarbonize Quebec and help New England do so as well. But just getting back to this magnetic field and childhood leukemia issue, the Savitz study that you financed confirmed, I think, in 83, the Wertheimer-Lepper study. But it's confusing because David Savitz later on did another paper saying, well, no, the link isn't that strong.
Well, that's true. And it's interesting that not only Savitz, but Anders Almboom, who contributed strongly to the evidence for elevated leukemia in children, sort of changed his tune years later. I considered both of them good friends, and I just, to this day, do not understand what happened. I recently went back to review the evidence that there's this association between magnetic fields and childhood leukemia. And that paper was published just a couple of years ago. And I took as the base three or four, I guess it was four meta-analyses that were published in about 2000. One by Omboom, and all of these meta-analyses at that time concluded that the evidence strongly indicated that magnetic field exposure to children increased the risk of childhood leukemia. I reviewed the publications that have occurred since that time and divided them into three groups. The first group were studies that demonstrated that there was a statistically significant elevation in risk of childhood leukemia in relation to exposure to magnetic fields. All but one of those were supported by government agencies or foundations. One was co-supported by the industry. Then there was another group, and each of these were about 10 publications. Another group that showed an elevated risk, but it wasn't quite statistically significant. All of these were supported by foundations or federal grants. And finally, the last group was totally funded by the industry. They found no significant effect in any of those papers. Mm-hmm. This indicates very clearly how bias based on who supports your research is a critical factor in what conclusions you reach. And unfortunately, this is so confusing to the public and to politicians.
And reporters.
They say that the evidence is inconsistent and inconclusive. Well, baloney, the evidence is not inconsistent if you look at reports published by credible scientists that do not have a conflict of interest.
Mm-hmm. Henry Lai found the same thing with the cell phone studies and brain cancer. 70% of those financed by industry said there was no link, and it was the opposite, 70% for independently funded studies.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. The same story with RF and brain cancer and other diseases. Mm-hmm. And in fact, in that paper we just looked at, I found actually a lot of new information about other well-documented effects of ELF magnetic fields.
Mm-hmm. So there's at least over a dozen studies today, and there's also people, was it IEEE or the electric utilities who found that there was a link with contact currents directly giving electricity low doses that are linked to childhood leukemia as well.
Yes. Mm-hmm. But, you know, I think the big concern here is the unwillingness of national and international organizations to objectively look at the facts. Mm-hmm. I, with colleagues from 5 European countries, went to the World Health Organization to plead with them to change their position, which was that there is no adverse health effects of electromagnetic fields. And this is the same office from which I have a collaborating center with the World Health Organization, not focused specifically on EMF. We got absolutely nowhere. And their comment was, well, the ICNIRP, this international, I'll never get the name quite right.
Council on Non-Ionization Radiation Protection.
Yes. They are an official NGO of the World Health Organization, and therefore they're the only ones they listen to. This is a self-supported organization. It has no credibility because it's self-supported, and it consistently has denied adverse health effects. This is just outrageous that the World Health Organization, that should be protecting the health of the people of the world, refuses to even acknowledge what I consider to be very well documented evidence, and to acknowledge the conflicts of interest of those people and those reports that are inconsistent with the conclusion that both ELF and RF cause cancer, they cause other diseases. And while they may not be the most dangerous thing in our environment, they an excess exposure cause human disease.
And contribute, yeah.
That's right. Now, of course, none of us are going to go back to the pre-electric, pre-wireless age. That's not the point. The point is that failure to acknowledge that excessive exposure is harmful is just incompatible with the public health principle that you do whatever you can to reduce exposures that are harmful. You have to balance risk versus benefit in everything, of course, and nobody denies that.
Yeah.
But to deny that there's any health effect in the face of overwhelming evidence is almost criminal in my judgment.
Yeah, I agree. Well, what's for sure is that the IARC, International Agency for Research on Cancer, classified 60 hertz magnetic fields as possibly carcinogenic. Critics will say that's the same thing as coffee or pickles, but we know we're doubling the risk of leukemia to children exposed to 3 or 4 milligauss on a 24-hour average long term. So it's pretty serious stuff. You mentioned ICNIRP, David. Let's talk about the elephant in the room here. We know that ICNIRP was founded by Michael Repacoli, a former Health Canada scientist, who also founded WHO's, the World Health Organization's EMF research project. But Microwave News many years ago said, well, it's official. He's an industry consultant. We know that very well. And it's the same thing with the FCC in the US, et cetera. But just to explain that you've been at Albany University for many, many years, where you're director of the Institute for Health and Environment, which you founded. You're a well-known authority on the dangers of PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls. And you recently had a falling out with your university. And I'd like you to explain that a little bit. What happened? Because you're a star witness in a case against Monsanto, right?
Well, yes, I've been involved in expert witness work for quite a while. And my personal research has been more focused on health effects of PCBs than EMF. I've been very much involved in EMF and remain involved in EMF, mainly because of my administrative work early on in the 80s over the New York State Power Lines project. But although I've published on EMF issues, those publications have been reviews. They've not been original research. Now, I've studied effects of PCBs in a number of populations, but the population where most of my studies have been done are the Mohawk Nation at Akwesasne, which is in northern New York, Quebec, and Ontario. And I've been working there since the mid-'80s, and we have literally hundreds of publications on the health effects of PCBs, many of which are work done in that community. Now that population is too small for us to study cancer, but I was a member of the IARC panel that looked at PCBs, and PCBs are rated as group 1 known human carcinogens. I could comment on that a little bit, because that is to say that even on the basis of IARC, the evidence that PCBs are dangerous is stronger than it is for either RF or ELF on the view of the International Agency for Research on Cancer. And I agree with that. The evidence on PCBs is just overwhelming. There's still an industry that fights back. And all PCBs in North America were manufactured by Monsanto, almost all.
So what happened 9 months ago? Monsanto requested public records on your service as expert witness, and then you were put on alternate assignment by your university. Explain that to me.
I was basically grounded. I was told I can't go to my office.
Why?
Basically, I was told I cannot talk with anybody at the university, including my 8 PhD students for whom I was the mentor. Now that got reversed fairly shortly because nobody else wanted to mentor all the PhD students that I had, many of whom were supported by the funds that I got from expert witness against Monsanto. I've been involved in other cases as well, including some EF cases, but EMF cases usually are brought by people that have no money. So I didn't receive much in the way of financial returns on those, but in the PCB cases, I would charge for my time, but rather than accepting the money myself, as most expert witnesses would do, I had the law company send them the money directly to the students that I mentor and to support basically their living expenses. Monsanto foiled the university on 3 different occasions. The first, they wanted to see all of my records related to my work at Akwesasne. Well, I've been working in there, as I said, my first grant application for study of PCBs at Akwesasne was submitted in 1987. So that was piles and piles of file cabinet drawers. Well, they took all of those away, and then they returned them a number of months later, and I didn't hear anything more about that. The interesting fact is that the Mohawks have sued Monsanto to the tune of $1.3 billion. And I was, of course, the lead expert witness because so much of the evidence for harm in that community were the papers that my colleagues and I have published specifically on that community.
So do you think the university was afraid of being sued by Monsanto?
I don't know that anybody has been sued by Monsanto, but Monsanto has certainly been sued by the Mohawks, and that case settled just last week.
Really?
I don't know for how much, but Monsanto caved and settled with the Mohawks. All right, so go back to my situation with foils. The second foil was for all of my financial records for any case that I was ever involved in as an expert witness. And I sort of could understand why Monsanto would want to see that, because one of the reasons I've been such an effective witness at trial is that I can honestly say I don't accept funds myself. I use them to support my students. And Monsanto probably wanted to see whether that was true. Well, they could have figured that out in a half a day because the records I have showed that. For some reason, the university got all upset about that FOIL request and decided they had to put me under investigation.
Because you were too clean?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Because you were too clean?
They thought maybe I wasn't so clean. After 9 months, they figured out that I hadn't done anything wrong. But in any case, that there was a third foil, which was all of my correspondence with some author that had written books about Monsanto. I had never even heard of this author, so that was not a big deal. So it was the requests for my financial records that triggered this alternate assignment. It's an outrageous policy that this university has. However, it turns out it is an agreement between the University Union of Professionals, so the faculty union, and the university, that if a faculty member is under investigation for something, they can be placed on alternate assignment, which usually means work from home. Now that makes sense if you're accused of violence or sexual misbehavior or sexual harassment or something, so your interaction with other people is questionable. That was never any concern in my situation. Although the general assumption, if a faculty member is put on alternate assignment, he must be, or he or she must be guilty of some sexual misconduct of something, some area, because
you must have certainly felt attacked in your integrity. What emotions do you go through?
Well, it certainly attacked my integrity. And there was no public announcement or no public explanation why I was placed on alternate assignment. They never told me while I was placed on alternate assignment. The implication was that I was running a consulting business on company time that they didn't know about. Well, that was totally false, because
It's public.
not only did the senior administration of the university know about it, the ways in which I was directing funds I received as expert witness work to my students was developed by consultations with the vice presidents for research. My Institute for Health and the Environment reports to the Office of the Vice President for Research. And I worked with two vice presidents, both of whom have long gone, in developing this program. So now the human resources part of the university, and of course, senior administration universities change over time.
Mhm.
So some of the current people didn't know about this, but again, it had all been developed in consultation with senior people at the university. There's just no excuse for this. There are attempts now by the University Senate to try to understand, do some of the senior members of the administrative staff have a lot of Monsanto stock? Do they have relatives that work for Monsanto or Bayer? I have no knowledge that that is the case.
Because Bayer,
I see of no other explanation why this would have happened.
well, certainly we could quote Al Gore to say that you're speaking what's the term again? Inconvenient truth. But that brings me back to EMFs. You're well known in the electromagnetic field and health circles for being the co-editor of the Bioinitiative report. Today, several reports, over 2,000 papers that you summarized, I believe, since 2007.
That's right. And the evidence has only grown stronger since then. We know a lot more about the mechanisms of EMF action. We know that EMF causes oxidative stress, and oxidative stress is the basis of many, many different diseases. It's a major factor in the cause of cancer, certainly a major factor in reproductive effects. All of these specific effects are influenced by both ELF and RF electromagnetic fields. Again, that mechanism of action is not specific to electromagnetic fields. It's common to many environmental factors, including exposure to PCBs. But the profile of symptoms that you get is different with the different chemical contaminants. I think our Bioinitiative report, while it's been widely criticized by everybody and his brother from industry to...
Yeah, they were saying that you're cherry picking. What do you answer to that?
Well, we were cherry picking in a sense that we were identifying the documented hazards caused by exposure to these things from electromagnetic fields. That's not cherry picking. Again, this goes back to the evidence I presented in that ELF paper a couple of years ago. When you have an industry that doesn't want to have its product declared to be hazardous, one of the most effective ways the industry has in fighting back is to hire their own hired guns to publish contrary conclusions. And this has happened for EMF consistently. That's documented in my report. It's happened for RF in the studies that you mentioned yourself, Andre. It's happened around the PCB literature, where there's clear evidence that Monsanto bought scientists to write papers that would try to counter the evidence that was so overwhelming from credible scientists who had made publications. So in the sense of cherry picking, if cherry picking means you only pay attention to publications that don't have a clear conflict of interest,
Peer review.
you're guilty of cherry picking.
I was speaking to a colleague who was actually the former president of the Quebec Federation of Journalists, and he was saying, listen, it's not my area of expertise. Everyone tells me that, of course, but I look for articles in Nature, in the New England Journal of Medicine, in the Lancet. Those majors rarely look at EMFs. Why is that?
Well, all of those journals, like most scientific journals, depend on peer reviewers. And so it's human nature. Now, I have one article in Lancet on EMFs. There aren't many, but I think the issue is that this is an indication of the success of the industry in making this a controversial area of research. Just because of all these publications where there's a clear bias, but these journals don't seem to pay much attention to that. And they're ignoring the evidence that there's harm here. I value New England Journal of Medicine as something I read every week. And I'm not aware of any article on EMF that's been published there. I haven't tried to publish there with on these issues. It's, I think, to some degree, a black mark on these publications that they're not giving adequate attention to what I see as real public health issues. But I do understand that it's hard to find 3 or 4 peer reviewers on EMF issues that are objective and recommend manuscripts to be published.
Mm-hmm. George Carlo actually sent me an article in the New England Journal of 1997 talking about pacemakers. And just last week, Apple put out a warning that you should not put your cell phone on your chest if you do have a pacemaker. Right. I mentioned Al Gore because I was told that when he was vice president, he was the one who was involved in the Federal Communication Commission's exposure limits, the FCC limits of what, 1996 was it?
Right, 96.
RFs. And that's something that I want to get back to the slides here. We spent a summer together writing. I asked you to write a rebuttal because there was an article in 2012 in La Presse, actually a letter by 50 university professors in Montreal in a daily, Le Devoir, saying, oh, no problem with smart meters. Now, none of these scientists had ever published any EMF in health research. They knew very little. And so I waited a few weeks. Nobody was replying. So I had to call you. And we got about 50 scientists and doctors to co-sign what you wrote. A few of them added important points. And one of them was a neurosurgeon in Australia, Dr. Kurana. And, most people say, well, I have a smart meter and I don't react to it. Well, I say, are you under 10 feet from it, or do you have several in your bedroom, which is the case in some people? Of course, we're all individuals. We all react differently to all pollutants. But this is what Dr. Kurana found, neurological effects below 10 feet. And when the utilities like Hydro-Quebec say there's no danger, they always refer to the ICNIRP and FCC or Health Canada exposure limits. Can you explain to people why those are really bogus?
Well, they're totally bogus because they're based on groups that totally deny, as a fundamental statement of faith, certainly not a fact, that there's no harm from exposure to electromagnetic fields. They're, for the most part, people in those organizations that have no health expertise. Cindy Sage and I went to visit the Federal Communications Commission staff several years ago to argue that those standards from 1996 were just way off base. And the FCC people said, well, we don't have any health expertise on our staff.
And nor does the FDA.
Yeah, we take our advice from the health agencies, but the FDA doesn't have any. The US EPA terminated their whole EMF program.
Under
So the blind leading the blind,
under
and
right?
refusing to listen to anybody else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if I recall, the EPA was really bothering the industry and federal administration. So I think that's why Al Gore, I was told, pulled the carpet under them and cut their funding, I believe.
You know, I don't know that story, but I'm not too surprised. But it remains a problem today that the agencies that set these standards have no health expertise, are not considering the weight of the evidence, and are totally bamboozled by these fallacious reports that come from industry funding.
Mm-hmm. But getting back to the FCC limits, it's only to prevent thermal effects of microwaves, right?
That's correct, and that's again the basis for the ICNIRP values as well. And that's what I was trying to say. This statement of faith that there are no adverse health effects except those caused by tissue heating. That comes from the physics and the engineering community. Those communities don't know anything about human biology. And it's ludicrous that that should be the basis for national and international standards.
Here's a 2013 letter from the American Academy of Pediatrics saying that the FCC limits do not protect children and pregnant women, nor reflect current use patterns. And so it's been years. Even the Cell Phone Task Force website is really great. Arthur Furstenberg came out with this page of warnings. Governments and organizations banned and warnings in 1993. EPA, FDA, and NIOSH all saying that the FCC standards are outdated, flawed, and nothing's happened since then.
Right. It's sad.
It's also a revolving door issue, isn't it? That the FCC and the Telecom Association.
That's correctly captured agency is exactly right.
People don't realize the last two heads, I believe, of the FCC used to work for the CTIA, Cell Phone Telecommunication Industry Association.
They come from the industry, and then when they go off the FCC, they go back to the industry. Just like Rapaccioli, who, while he worked for WHO, created ICNIRP, and then has managed to basically capture the World Health Organization on the issue of electromagnetic fields.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you think that the latest news are going to make things move a little bit more in coming years? Here we have these families in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. One of them had to move out of their home. They were so sick with their two daughters. And the health board backed them, but the city did not give the health board money to go to court because Verizon was suing them. But this is really recent and very important. The Massachusetts Association of Health Boards is backing the Pittsfield Health Board. And more scientists are coming out since 2018, when two studies, including the US NTP, proved that you can cause tumors in rats, even though they believed that they could not. And the FDA downplayed this, of course. And the New York Times, there's also people have to realize that mass media out there, majors, many of them are either owned by the telecom industry or they're among their major advertisers. So it's millions and millions of dollars of budgets. Uh, so we keep seeing these reports like this one by Dr. Belpogi for the European Parliament. And there are states like New Hampshire, which had a commission on the impact of 5G, and they may legislate or pass the buck to municipalities. Are you hopeful that things are going to move? Because there's basically very few studies on 5G, these millimeter wave, very high frequency gigahertz levels. What do you think?
Well, I'm not sure that I can say I'm hopeful. I'm pretty pessimistic at this stage. You know, we've had overwhelming evidence for health hazards, specifically cancer, for all these years, and nobody's paying attention. Well, why? I think it's because everybody likes their electronic devices.
Yeah.
And the public doesn't really want to hear that you spend too much time on your cell phone, you're going to develop brain cancer. Well, the brain cancer happens years later. So, you know, people don't, it's not that you're getting sick tomorrow. There's increasing evidence on this issue of electrohypersensitivity. These are subtle but disabling consequences of exposure to electromagnetic fields seen in not everybody, but in some people. Fatigue and headaches and weakness and just general sense of ill health. But not everybody gets those symptoms.
No.
So it's easy to sort of dismiss them. I guess my concern is that we've had all of this evidence for many years. So is there additional evidence that is going to be developed that will change people's mind? The reality is we have almost no funding for additional research. The research that comes out is usually done by small organizations. I think the National Toxicology Program and the Ramazzini Institute demonstration of cancer in animals should have shaken up the whole wide world. But even the FDA, the funder of the study, at least of the NTP study, basically minimized the results, which showed exactly what was expected to be shown by those scientists that are familiar with the objective peer-reviewed literature. Mm-hmm. So I'm not terribly optimistic. And you know, this leads to one other point. I was sort of celebrated by colleagues a couple of weeks ago after being returned back to my place in the university. And one of the questions I was asked is, how do you or I or anybody else change public positions on issues related to environmental factors? My major route has been to do research, publish quality scientific papers in peer-reviewed journals. That's what I've done for my research on PCBs. Again, as I said, most of my work on EMF has not been my own research, it's been review articles. But that's how I publish. And I look at what I've done over the years, and I don't see very much change in public policy as a result of that. I do have one episode that I thought maybe did result in change in public policy. That was on a different issue. It was on fracking for natural gas. And I was the corresponding author in a study that looked at release of toxic gases in 5 states from fracking operations. And we demonstrated some of the concentrations were 10,000 times what safety limits were. And when fracking was outlawed in New York State, the announcer waived my publication as a reason for not allowing fracking in the United States, in New York. It's the only time that my research sort of has gotten to the level of even being acknowledged in a public policy decision. But so I'm a little discouraged by having just publications change things. Advocacy is another route. Most scientists are very reluctant to be considered to be advocates.
I was going to say, do you consider you're an activist or advocate yourself?
I don't consider myself to be an activist, no. I'm a public health physician. I consider my position on these issues, trying to push government and agencies, to be part of my job. It's not that I'm going out of my way to be an activist. The activists play a very important role. For the most part, they're not scientists. They're people that have some knowledge of the situation, that they're trying to protect their families, they're trying to protect themselves, and they play a very important role because they are more effective at pushing regulatory agencies than I, as just a well-published scientist. Mm. Then there is the third route, and that's the route that I've taken increasingly, and that's litigation. And in my experience, that's the most effective route to change status. Mm. That's why I've been an expert against Monsanto. That's why I've been an expert against utility companies in a number of states, including in Montreal. Now, most of those cases have not been successful. But, I think when the polluter has to pay, that makes more difference than when you just get an article in the local newspaper. It's when the pocketbook hurts, then you can get change. Now, there's a groundswell of cases against Monsanto all over the country. Monsanto just settled with the state of Oregon for contamination of the boundary waters. There's ongoing litigation for the state of Maryland and the state of Washington on the same issue. As I've said already, the Mohawks just settled with Monsanto. Monsanto made the PCBs, but in the case of Mohawks, it was General Motors and Alcoa and Reynolds Metals that used them. So all of these corporations are responsible for the contamination and the adverse health effects. So I think we need to get everybody working together. The scientists that do the publications, the activists that spread the word, and then working with the legal community to try to push and make the polluter pay and make the government change the way it does things. Yeah. My first involvement in PCB litigation was in Anniston, Alabama. That's one of the two sites in the US where Monsanto has plants that made PCBs. There had been no regulation from the state or the federal government, or almost none, because Monsanto was such a big economic driver locally. And then when a suit was made against the poor people that lived next to the plant that had high PCB levels and were suffering from disease, then finally US EPA came in and did something. It still is not listed as a national priority list site, which I think it should have been long ago, but at least there's federal regulation. But the only level at which you get compensation to the victims is through litigation. So working on these three things in tandem, I think, is an important way to proceed.
Yeah, well, you need good science when you go to court. There were a few judgments in Europe for electrosensitivity recognized in France at least twice, and in Italy with brain cancers, workers who were forced by their employer to use a cell phone 8 hours or more. But what's interesting and what people don't know as well is that there are a lot of laws out there, especially in Europe, even in Israel and France, for instance. Wi-Fi is banned in nursery schools and daycares. They're limited in elementary schools. So people don't realize if there's precautionary laws, national laws in those countries, there may be something behind all this if they're really being careful. And I think it was indeed because there was science and there was a lot of public opposition. In France, they had national consultations on EMFs, which led to this law. And in the US, you have tons of different lawsuits, but no judgments yet, eh?
Well, I was a plaintiff in the suit against the FCC, requesting that they change their policy and review the scientific evidence. Now, we effectively won that case, but they have done nothing.
With the Environmental Health Trust, the judge said what they have, what they,
And Children's Environmental Defense, two of them
yeah.
together.
And the judge ordered them to do what?
To establish groups that would review the scientific evidence and therefore adjust their standards accordingly.
And were they given 12 or 24 months to do so?
I don't know exactly the answer to that question. I do know that there is nothing that's appeared publicly in response to that judgment.
So they'll have to go
But
back.
again, I think the most effective way to go after these agencies is litigation rather than just advocacy and publishing papers and other things.
Yeah.
Now, litigation is very expensive, and most people don't have the resources to go after big, powerful, and wealthy corporations. That's why it takes really extraordinary people, extraordinary lawyers who are willing to risk, financial loss to go after these companies.
Even the city of Berkeley lost its case where they were mandating stickers where people buy cell phones to inform.
That's right. That's right.
They lost that case. Yeah. I was really impressed by Dr. Birnbaum, whom I interviewed a few times, because she's one of the top American toxicologists. She's now retired as head of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. So she was the boss of the National Toxicology Program. But before she retired, she organized with CC Doucette a day at NIH, the health and buildings roundtables, a day with different experts such as Martin Paul talking about RF radiation and different health issues. So that was interesting. And now she's retired and she's very vocal out there. That's what I'm noticing. It's often when people retire that their job isn't threatened. Of course, she was courageous to be implicated before retiring, but it seems there's a lot of lack of courage out there among civil servants, isn't there?
Well, that's absolutely right. And I certainly understand that Linda, now that she's retired, can say things that she couldn't say when she was director of the Institute. I worked for the New York State Department of Health for 18 years. And even though I was a spokesperson for New York on EMF issues, there was a limit of what I could say because the health department works under the governor, which works under the legislature. And so one has to recognize that federal agencies, health agencies, state health agencies, these are politically vulnerable organizations who cannot make recommendations solely on the basis of health concerns. What Linda's come out strongly as a person that enunciates the hard evidence that exists on the relationship between EMF exposure and disease.
And she was saying basically flat out, actually, the public health officials are not doing their job of
they are not doing their
the
job.
public.
Yeah.
It's all based on disinformation. So yeah, it is a little bit discouraging. But people, to me, what's a no-brainer is that people feel better when they reduce their exposure, even when they're not aware that the exposure is reduced, or they don't even know that it may be harmful. So, because a lot of industry scientists will say it's the nocebo effect. People are scared of this radiation, which is harmless, but actually no. Animals and children are reacting, and they react less when you just reduce or eliminate the exposure, right?
That's right. Now, another interesting thing that's new that I had hoped would maybe change attitudes is the whole Havana syndrome.
Yeah.
This is fascinating. It's called the Havana syndrome because members of the U.S. Embassy in Havana, Cuba, began to experience strange symptoms which are basically EHS symptoms: headaches, fatigue,
Electrohypersensitivity.
mental cognitive function decline, just feeling of ill health. And nobody knew really much what this was caused by. And then people like Beatrice Golub reported that this probably was directed microwave radiation. Then the U.S. Academy of Science did a review, and they concluded also it was most likely due to electromagnetic fields. Mm-hmm. Then that began to occur in other countries, in Australia, in Vietnam, in China, in Moscow, and a lot of paranoia began to develop. Now, it's interesting to look back in the Cold War days. The Soviets irradiated the U.S. Embassy in Moscow with microwaves, caused a lot of panic, a lot of cover-up, but some 50% of the people in the embassy began to be unable to sleep at night. They had headaches, they had fatigue, all the same symptoms. Well, about a year ago, the headlines in the New York Times came out. The head of it, sorry, the Havana syndrome is not due to microwave exposure. Well, 2 weeks ago, another headline came out. The Havana syndrome may well be due to pulsed microwaves. I'm sorry, I'm just recovering from a cold. I really had thought that as we would develop evidence that it was pulse microwaves, and this would change some attitudes, but this is obviously secret kind of stuff that governments don't want to hear.
So what do you recommend people do, or where should they get their information to inform their friends and families and employers to get the facts about EMF?
Well, I'm a firm believer in the precautionary principle, which is to say, when there's a question of harm, even if the evidence is not 100%, the only reasonable thing to do, I'm sorry, Andre. The only reasonable thing to do is to take steps to reduce your exposure. That's true from chemicals. That's true from EMF. We need to continue to work with research, with activism, with litigation. But at an individual level, we have at least some ability to control our exposure from wireless and extra low frequency EMF. And a responsible individual will do what they can to protect their family. That means if you have Wi-Fi, turn it off at night. Don't sleep with a cell phone under your pillow.
Or cable your house. Cable your house. You don't need Wi-Fi 24/7.
You don't need
and 12
You don't need Wi-Fi. Cable works well. Wired connections to the internet. Internet's important for everybody to have access to, but use a wired connection, not a Wi-Fi.
Yeah, it's faster, safer, and more cyber secure. You don't.
And we need to get Wi-Fi out of schools. Wire the schools. Certainly, it's important to have internet connections, but wired connections are safe. This whole business of smart meters is ridiculous. The only benefit is to the utility. that doesn't have to hire people to go around and read the meters. No, there's legitimate debate about how dangerous smart meters are, how dangerous 5G is. There has been little research because there's almost no funding. The research that has been done, usually done on a shoestring budget, is not optimal. So we need more research, but how to convince funding agents to support this kind of research is a real problem.
And they're not measuring people's exposure. This is very rarely done, but we have two recent papers out of Sweden by Hardell and Nielsen, where people got very sick after the installation of 5G cell towers, or microcell, actually, small cell antennas, they call them, even though some of them are gigantic. So I think it's something that people should really look about, especially also the fact that it can reduce the value of your property by 20%. It's starting in New York. It's been a couple of years in San Francisco, where they had these huge, like big penises right outside of people's windows, these huge antennas with $1 million or $2 million or $3 million condo a few feet away. I think maybe that's going to wake people up. But here we did have people in these two studies very, very sick. They moved away and their symptoms went away very quickly. Well, listen, David, it's already been an hour, and I think you need a drink of water.
Well, I apologize for my inability to stop.
Oh, do not apologize. I'm so happy to have you with us today. It's been a great pleasure and honor, and always a learning experience with you. So let's.
Very good to see you, Andre.
Yeah, let's keep in touch, and
thanks for your continued effort to change the world.
Well, you too. I think we're all children.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye now.